Thank you very much, Anne, and thank you all for being here today on this rainy afternoon. It's a pleasure to be presenting here today anew in the Sainsbury Wing, just 2 weeks after we reopened as part of our great bicentenary conclusion celebration on May the 10th. And it's great to be here to be able to speak about our exhibition, which opened just at the end of March, on José María Velasco, who's the preeminent landscape painter of the 19th century in Mexico. He's a master of sweeping views of his country, and he's attuned to the nation's complex past as well as its rapidly changing present. He's a leading Mexican artist in the generations before Frida Kahlo and Diego Rivera and the Mexican muralists, and I can bet that many of you, were you asked to name a Mexican artist of the 19th century, might come up blank. The hope, I think, of this show and our proposal here at the National Gallery is that that will no longer be the case. You will come to know Velasco and why, indeed, he was so influential, both in Mexico and elsewhere. This is our first ever show on a historical Latin American artist. It takes place during our 200th birthday, so late coming, but nonetheless important. And this exhibition has the double distinction of taking place not only during our bicentenary, but also, in a happy coincidence, the bicentenary of diplomatic relations between the United Kingdom and Mexico. Dexter Dalwood is the co-curator of this exhibition, and as Anne said, he is the one who first approached us about the show several years ago, and I've worked with him now since 2022. Dexter is an artist, and he came to be familiar with Velasco's work living in Mexico itself, and came to wonder why it was that Velasco, this amazing artist, wasn't better known elsewhere. And so we have Dexter to thank for bringing this exhibition idea to us. So in my introduction today, I'm going to trace the course of Velasco's career. Then I'll weave together some other sort of episodes from parts of his career that will help us understand in a bit more detail the exhibition. Velasco brings together episodes of history, both national and natural, to tell a story about the enduring image of Mexico. And his paintings remain influential today. I remember when Dexter and I began to collaborate together on this project, one of the first things that he brought me from Mexico was actually a cigarette lighter with the image of the cactus on it, the cactus that is both on the cover of the catalog and the poster of the show. So you get a sense of just how ubiquitous these images are in Mexico. So today, first, I will do a close look at Velasco's most significant work, his great masterpiece. Then we'll survey his career and his scientific interests, and indeed that's one of the great propositions of the show, is that Velasco is as interesting as an artist as he is a scientist. And then consider his contributions to international exhibitions, especially to Paris in 1889, where he sends some 60 paintings. And then I'll conclude by considering, just briefly, his late work and his legacy. But we should situate ourselves first, geographically and historically, in the world of Velasco. José María Velasco was born in 1840 in the small town of Temascalcingo, but he lives almost his entire life in Mexico City. Mexico City is in the center of the peninsula. It's in a high elevated volcanic bowl, and it's also, during this period, a place of extraordinary and rapid change, both politically and industrially. Mexico liberates itself from Spain in 1821, becoming an independent nation, casting off the reign of the viceroys, which had endured for some 300 years. And there's turbulent politics throughout this period. In the 1840s, Mexico is invaded by the United States, the Mexican-American War, which leads at its conclusion to the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, which cedes many of Mexico's territories over to the United States. So much of the western US was once a part of Mexico. So California, Nevada, Colorado, and other states. This discord, though, continues. The political situation doesn't really improve through much of Velasco's youth. And in the 1860s, French troops invade Mexico, this time under the leadership of the Emperor Maximilian, an Austrian archduke who was plucked from the castle of Miramare in sort of eastern Italy to be set up as the emperor by Napoleon III, Emperor of the French. So all of this is happening while Velasco is in his teens and 20s. But we'll look now at the picture that is by far considered to be his greatest achievement. And it brings together many of the key themes that run through his work, but also through the exhibition. The prime one being landscape and, or as, history. And it shows us as well his great subject, the view of the Valley of Mexico. So this is the volcanic bowl in which the city of Mexico sits. And of course, if you've been to Mexico City today or have seen photographs, you know that it's sort of a carpet of concrete that covers this entire sort of basin. And here, the modern city is just in the far background. It's painted in mid-1877, and it's intended for an exhibition in Paris, the Exposition Universelle in Paris in 1878. And as the great scholar of Velasco, Fausto Ramirez, says, it is a sublime view, but it is not one, unlike those painted by American landscape painters in the same period. It is not a view of untouched wilderness, of untouched terra nullius. It is one, indeed, in which the land and the landscape are a great repository of cultural history that stretches back centuries, not only taking in the period of the viceroys, but also, and importantly, the period of pre-Hispanic time. Velasco is quite a particular artist, very fastidious in his descriptions of his work. And he says that this depicts the light at 3 p.m. in the afternoon, early in June. In an article 7 years later, he discusses it in almost a scientific kind of tone. The clarity of the light in the Valley of Mexico to him has something to do with the clarity of the air. The young poet, Octavio Paz, who goes on to win the Nobel Prize in Literature, started off as an art critic, among other things, and he saw this work in the great exhibition in Mexico City at the Palacio de Bellas Artes in 1942. And he wrote then about its sober austerity, its rigidity, and its constancy. Those are often pejorative adjectives when used to describe a painting, but certainly in Velasco's case, and definitely in the way that Paz uses them, they are a sense of this deep reserve that is contained in these paintings that are often quite plain to begin with, but not, as we'll see, once we get into looking closely. The painting is celebrated after its display in Mexico City in 1877. The critic Felipe González, who's writing for La Libertad, says, quote, "This wonderful landscape should be sent to Paris so that our natural beauty can be known and admired, so that the splendor of the Anahuac Valley, Valley of Mexico, which has no rival, can be shown, and more than anything else, so that the artistic talent of the sons of Mexico can be valued elsewhere." The painting gets the first prize, and Velasco gets a medal from the president, Porfirio Diaz. There are 7 versions of this painting. Velasco, as was very common in the 19th century, makes a number of repetitions and variations that are sold to collectors, but they all derive from this great work, which is, of course, this sort of synthesis of what the city of Mexico looked like in the 19th century. But there's more here than just the landscape of Velasco's time. There is a deep sense of history as well. So you see in the foreground here, the nopal cactus and the eagle with a little bird in its beak. And if that reminds you of something, it should remind you of first the Mexican flag and the national seal, on which the eagle with a snake in its beak sit at the center. And the reason that that is so important, and the reason that this helps us to hearken back to pre-Hispanic times, is because this story relates to the history of the founding of Tenochtitlan. Tenochtitlan is the capital city of the Aztecs, or the Mexica, and it's on those ruins that modern Mexico City is built. It's established in the middle of Lake Texcoco in 1325. So that entire valley that we saw in Velasco's picture was almost all filled with water, and the city was at its center, a bit like Venice. And according to Aztec myth, their patron deity, Huitzilopochtli, told their ancestors, when they were on their sort of wanderings, to leave their home and to find the place on which a harpy eagle alights on a nopal cactus, and that's the place at which they should found their city. And this is recorded in this work, which is in the Baldwin Library, in the Codex Mendoza, probably done by an indigenous artist in collaboration with a Spanish scribe, that shows us the story of this founding. So the importance of the pre-Hispanic past in Mexico was central in the 19th century as the nation began to develop an idea of what the national self-image could look like. And it couldn't be derived only from the viceregal past. Indeed, it should also be derived from the pre-Hispanic past. And this is the earliest image that we have in sort of European sources of the city of Tenochtitlan. So you can see that it's really in the center of Lake Texcoco, surrounded on all sides by water and joined to the mainland by causeways. And this was published with the letters of Hernán Cortés, who arrives in 1521. So this comes out very, very shortly thereafter. And there's also slightly more recent history in this painting, which is a map of the national history. At the very middle of the picture, at the foot of the hill of Tepeyac, we see a complex of buildings. And Velasco has taken care to pick these out because it was on the hill of Tepeyac, and these buildings are part of this complex dedicated to the apparition that occurred there of the Virgin of Guadalupe. In 1531, the Virgin appears to this Nahua indigenous man, Juan Diego, who was recently converted to Christianity. In a number of apparitions, she eventually then leaves her image, so the story goes, on his tilma, on his cloak. And this is held to be an image created by the hand of God. And that is the image that is still venerated at the Basilica of Guadalupe today. And the Basilica is exactly what Velasco has shown us here. So it's one of the most important sites of Mexican religious life. And it's surprising, though, that in the 19th century, almost none of this symbolic freight was discussed by critics. I mean, perhaps in part because it was so apparent. It begins to be mentioned in a bit more detail in the 20th century when Justina Fernandez comments on the obvious symbolism of the eagle and the nopal. And Velasco, of course, attends to his own time. In the far background, we can just see modern Mexico City. There's dust rising from the tracks that lead to the city, and in the far distance, sort of smoke rising. He also pays some attention, which we'll return to later on, to the geological features of the Valley of Mexico. We have Lake Texcoco, which is now completely filled in and had begun to be drained by the Spanish, as well as two of these returning features that appear once and again in Velasco's quadros, the volcano of Popocatépetl, which is the little cone-shaped one, and the more humpback-shaped one, which is Iztaccíhuatl. And these are both associated with pre-Hispanic deities, and you'll see them throughout his oeuvre. But for now, let's go back to Velasco's beginnings. He's born in Temascalcingo to a family of minor local officials, and he moves to Mexico City at about the age of 7. He works for a time in his relative's textile business, selling shawls and other things, and doesn't seem to be destined for the life of an artist. He begins to be interested, he studies from a young age at some sort of drawing academy, but doesn't begin to take it up very seriously until he's in his mid-teens, so relatively late for the 19th century. And he studies from the age of 15, taking evening classes at the Academy of San Carlos, the main center for the teaching of the arts in Mexico City, which had been established by the Spanish in the late 18th century. It was the first art academy in the Americas. And his first teacher there in the art of landscape painting, which he dedicates himself to throughout most of his career, is this Italian painter, Eugenio Landesio. Eugenio Landesio comes from just outside Turin, from a small town. He trains in Rome at the Academy of San Luca, and then is asked in 1855 to come to Mexico to form part of the professoriate at the Academy at San Carlos. It's quite interesting because the 1850s is an early time for someone to be engaged purely as a teacher of landscape painting. And so Landesio is in some ways on the forefront of this institutionalization of landscape. And this instruction that he meted out to his students had to do with the study in a very empirical way of nature. And we see Landesio here just 2 years after he arrives in Mexico. He's painting at the Hacienda of Madlala, which is the property of this family, the De la Hidalga family, who we see one of the members of there. And you can see exactly the kind of instruction and the kind of method that Landesio would have set out for Velasco. He sets out the idea that you should always make an on-site sketch before returning to the studio to build up a much more sort of narrativized picture. And so we can see down there, seated on a little stool, with his paint box on his knees, Landesio engaged in making a picture of this tremendous aqueduct. And during this period, Velasco, in addition to studying the arts and painting, takes lessons in botany and zoology. at the National School of Medicine in Mexico City, where his brother studies also to be a doctor. So he begins from a very early age to bring together this dual interest in not only representing the things of the Valley of Mexico, but in understanding them in a quite profound scientific way. And that also runs throughout his career. This painting that we see on the left is a picture by Landesio, and on the right, a work by Velasco. The painting of the Apennines on the left was actually sent to Mexico, to the Academy at San Carlos, before Landesio even had been engaged to teach there. So this picture was purchased as an example for students working in Mexico. It then remains in the collection of San Carlos, and Velasco, in his early years as a student here in 1862, at the age of 22, is clearly inspired by his master's sort of vision of nature and this intense focus on representing, with a lot of botanical study, the kinds of things that are appearing in his pictures is one that he borrows from Landesio and continues throughout his career. And he quickly becomes Landesio's most promising pupil, and they develop quite a close personal relationship. And you begin to see how it is that Velasco applies the same strategies of painting that Landesio has used, indeed that Landesio has taught him. So here we have these two pictures of the goat herd of San Angel. So in the picture on the left, this is the sketch that he makes in 1861 as a preparatory study. So he's painting en plein air in front of the motif and deciding what will be the focus in the end of the sort of narrativized, the developed canvas in the studio. In the picture here on the left, we can see the left foreground is quite empty, the factory much less imposing. And when he turns over the course of the next sort of year and a half to paint the larger version in the studio, you begin to see how it is that Velasco inserts a story of tradition and modernity, or tradition and industrialization, into these paintings. And he's doing this from his early 20s. So in the picture here on the right, the version made in the studio, the left foreground is now filled up with this very, very closely observed agave plant. So this is the plant which is used to make tequila, mezcal, and other sort of beverages that would have been associated, especially with the pre-Hispanic past. And then he also sort of amplifies everything to make this even clearer. On the right, the factory, which doesn't quite look like that in real life. It's taking its power from a dam on the Rio Magdalena, sort of in what is now a sort of southwestern part of Mexico City, but then completely in the countryside. Has these windows and all these kinds of perforations in it that really don't seem to have existed in real life. So this is Velasco, as he always does, developing and making clear the ways in which his themes should be expressed in his works. You also have the insertion of figures, which allow us to follow the story in a bit more detail. Up on the roof on the right, we have a man who seems to shout out or to call down to the man on the other side, the cabrillo, the goat herd, who is driving his charges up away from the precipice. So this story of landscape and industrialization is one that will run throughout much of Velasco's oeuvre. But in his early works, he often paints what we might think of sort of a genre painting. This is a landscape of the Alameda. So this is a park in the center of Mexico City, still there today. And this is particularly interesting because in the 1860s, of course, this is the time during which Maximilian and his court are ruling over Mexico. And the woman in the white dress at the center, riding side saddle, is thought to be the Empress Carlota, Charlotte, who was Maximilian's wife. So there is this sort of awareness of the political situation in which he's living. Velasco, though, in the 1870s, begins to make real strides in his art and to move away from depicting relatively small or relatively detailed little scenes into making pictures that really deal with the grandeur of the Valley of Mexico. And these are the works for which he's best known still today. In the exhibition, we have this wonderful sketch, which is the first sort of idea for the first large-scale painting that he makes of the Valley of Mexico at this kind of great remove. And these buildings here in the front, you may recognize from the bottom left of the 1877 painting, are part of the religious complex around Tepeyac, so the Basilica of Guadalupe and the other sort of attendant religious institutions that are attached to that. You also see the way that Velasco, trained as a scientist and relatively persnickety, it seems, by nature when you read his letters, is also very careful to note down exactly what he's painting, we have on the top right a legend of the different locations that he's showing us, and just here in the very bottom left, a couple of annotations for color. So he's taken this drawing, probably made on site, and annotated it with color notes for later development. His first great international success is this work, a view of the Valley of Mexico from the hill of Santa Isabel. And this is painted in 1875, so at the age of 35. This work, as you can see, quite an enormous picture. If you go to the exhibition, it's one of the first things you'll see right when you walk in. And in it, Velasco develops this interest in showing sort of the great panorama of the valley and linking it together with different parts of its history, just as he does in that great picture from 2 years later that we began with. In this picture, he retains the figures in the foreground, and in the later one, he takes them out. But you can still see in this work some of the influence of Landesio. Landesio is about to leave Mexico to return to Europe. And in it, you can still see the kind of reddish brown chiaroscuro that was very typical of Landesio's painting, and indeed of the kind of romantic European landscape painting, which was the tradition that Landesio came from. This work is also painted for an international exhibition. It's painted to be sent to Philadelphia in 1876 for the 100th anniversary of the American independence, so the Centennial Exhibition. And according to Velasco's own account, he makes this entire painting on site, on top of the hill of Santa Isabel, over the course of 3 months. Dexter, who is himself a painter, was quite funny about this, saying, could you imagine painting a picture this size and trying to get that kind of detail in the foreground? You sort of stand here and then walk all the way around to see what you're painting in the front of it. So it seems very unlikely that Velasco would have painted this entire thing on site, because there are also a number of sketches that exist for the figures. So he's likely has the idea and maybe paints part of the picture on top of the hill of Santa Isabel, but returns to paint most of it, we think, in his studio. He also is very clear about where this painting is intended to go, and he signs, and you can just make it out down here, on the rock in the foreground, and he signs José María Velasco, Pintor Mexicano, so Mexican painter, just in case you're going to get confused with anywhere else. He wants you to be clear that you're looking at Mexico. In this comparison, you see the way that Velasco's mature style really appears by 1877. So these works are separated by 2 years. They're painted from the very same vantage point. And we know that Velasco, of course, like any landscape painter, would recompose or sort of take parts of the landscape out or in, depending on what kind of effect he wanted to achieve. And you can see just how different the same location appears in both. In this picture on the right, the 1877 version, he takes a much more aerial view. You're sort of flying out over the valley, and you're not led into the picture by these sort of staffage figures in the front like you are in the 1875 view. There's also quite a change of palette. Instead of the sort of darkish tones of the picture on the left, Velasco begins to have this great lightness and sort of sunny quality that really is apparent in especially the picture from 1877. He also takes out the figures. So rather than have this woman who is probably intended to be an indigenous woman, instead we have sort of the history of Mexico evoked through the episode of the águila, the eagle, and the nopal cactus. You can also see, and this is interesting in terms of the environmental change that Velasco is documenting, the way that the lakes fill and refill, empty and drain based on the season. So in the picture on the left, we have this area here, which is a lagoon called the Lagoon of Santa Isabel, which was a seasonal one that fell empty with rains, and during the dry periods would dry out entirely. On the right, you can see that the whole area has become dried out. So there is this consciousness of the environmental change that is happening in the Valley of Mexico. Velasco, though, is not just a landscape painter. He's also a painter with a deep interest in history, as we've already seen. And his paintings of archaeological sites, as we would now think of them, are really an extension of that historical interest. In these two paintings of Teotihuacan, we see him engaging with these great sites that are just about 50 kilometers northeast of Mexico City. He combines his aptitude for putting together sort of a stunning vista with this interest in pre-Hispanic archaeology. And this is painted, both of these are painted on a visit to the site with Gumersindo Mendoza, who's the director of the National Museum, the Museo Nacional. And Velasco works the museum as a draftsperson. And these are quite remarkable because Teotihuacan is not actually an Aztec or Mexica site. It is a site that the Aztec and Mexica found in the Valley of Mexico when they came to it in the 1300s. Teotihuacan as a city and sort of religious complex seems to date from maybe sort of 300, 400 AD, and was abandoned by about the year 500 for reasons that still are unknown to us. It's not clear still, even to modern archaeologists, who necessarily the Teotihuacanos were, but when the Mexica encountered them there, they incorporated this site into sort of the founding myths of their own civilization. And so their wonder and their interest in them had long existed. And Velasco, in returning to paint them in the 19th century, also shows us how long that lasted and how important these pyramids were to the construction of some kind of national self-image. The paintings are also remarkable because they show us Teotihuacan before any really large-scale investigations. One thing, yes, but also digs had begun. And you see in this picture, you can't quite make it out, that Velasco is actually painting from the top of the Pyramid of the Moon, looking down the Avenue of the Dead toward the Pyramid of the Sun. And all of these areas that are seem like sort of berms or mounds of dirt, underneath those there were still remains that were uncovered at a later date. Beginning in the 1880s, Leopoldo Batres has sort of a whole series of excavations that begin to reconstruct, sometimes in more fanciful ways than others, what Teotihuacan looked like in its original state. Another part of Velasco's interest went beyond sort of historical and into, as I've said, the botanical. The natural sciences and natural history, more broadly construed, are a really key component of Velasco's oeuvre. And the flora of Mexico in particular, that's one of the sections of the exhibition, were a topic to be returned to again and again. In the late 1860s, when he's in his late 20s, probably as a money-making venture, at least in part, he illustrates a series of indigenous plants from the Valley of Mexico in an attempt to create a publication called The Flora of the Valley of Mexico. It exists for only a couple of months and doesn't really catch on, but it gives you a sense of just how thoroughgoing his scientific interests were. He's not simply a dabbler in the way that some 19th century painters like Cézanne, for example, who also had a great interest in geology in terms of a scientific approach, were. Velasco really studied and published in a number of different ways. This painting shows us this tremendous sort of wonder of nature in the state of Oaxaca. It's painted near a small village, still tiny today, called Tecomavaca. And near that site where Velasco had been traveling on a return trip to the city of Oaxaca, he saw this tremendous cardon, sort of giant cactus. And he paints it not just as a botanical study, which it certainly is in one sense, but also as a sort of a great view of the splendor of Mexican nature. And he makes that clear for us to scale by having this very, very tiny man just presented in front of the cactus. This painting is an icon in Mexico, as I already said, but so much so that even at MUNAL, so the Museo Nacional de Arte in Mexico City, sort of our counterpart institution, who have generously lent 17 works to the exhibition, that is the image that's on the door of the elevators. So it splits in the middle as you enter into the building. And as I said, Velasco, as a biologist, really had quite a deep engagement with Mexican life. Not only its plant life, but also the creatures that swam in the lakes that surrounded the city of Mexico. So he publishes a number of scientific papers on the axolotl, the ajolote, which is this wonderful-looking little amphibian, which is native to the lakes of the Valley of Mexico. And so Velasco does a number of studies on them to try to understand them better. And the axolotl had long been a great interest in the scientific literature related to Latin America, but Velasco's contributions were discussed by European scientists, and he had a couple of sort of exchanges of letters with August Weismann in particular, who was a follower of Darwin. And so these, I think, give you a sense of just how closely Velasco engaged with the science of his time. And so it's no coincidence that when he paints a work like this, like Chalco, he shows us not only this, again, opposition really between tradition and modernity. Chalco, which is the little village there in the background, was one of the lake ports that would have supplied Tenochtitlan during the time of the Mexica. But Velasco is very careful to note, in the background there, you can just see that a train now circumnavigates the village, so it doesn't have the same kind of purpose it once did. But Chalco and Xochimilco, the two lakes that in the 19th century were still more full than they are now. Xochimilco exists now mostly sort of a series of channels and canals. And in that environment is where the axolotl lived. So that's where the amphibian that Velasco had studied spent its life. And so in painting a work like this, it's not only about that opposition between tradition and modernity, it's also trying to show us the way that these environments, I think, are changing. And then the final arena of sort of scientific knowledge that Velasco really strove to improve himself in was geology. In the 19th century, geology was quite a new science, and what it was, in a way, was an extension of Velasco's historical interest. It was giving us a new and different history of the Earth. And the age of the Earth, at that point, fixed at 4,000 years old, they began to have new ideas that it could be 40,000 years old, or even more. And this understanding that something had been there long before us, and something had been affected over millions of years, was one, I think, that allowed Velasco to really engage quite closely with what Fausto Ramirez calls his mineral paintings, so his rock paintings. There's also an interesting parallel, certainly here in our collection, with the work of Paul Cézanne, the French painter who also had a very deep interest in geology for similar kinds of reasons, because it showed us the underlying structures of the Earth. And Velasco's, as we've seen, focus on understanding in a really deep way what was actually the subject of his painting had a similar appeal to him. And paintings by Velasco, particularly the 1875 view of the Valley of Mexico from Santa Isabel, were actually used by the Mexican geologist Mariano Bárcena in Philadelphia to illustrate a lecture on the geology of Mexico City. He used the painting as a way of discussing the different ways that rocks had been laid down. These works show us a different kind of approach, especially this tremendous picture on the right, titled Rocks, is an extraordinary kind of portrait of this great rock on the hill of Tepeyac. So it's not only that this is a geological feature, this is also something that harkens back to that great religious significance of the place for Velasco and for Mexico in particular. And in at least one other version of this work, Velasco usually paints several versions, there is one in which sort of a blasted wooden cross just appears on the top of the rock to make the situation of the apparition of the Virgin even more apparent. And some of Velasco's largest works, as we already have seen, were made expressly to be sent to international exhibitions. So the great views of 1875 and 1877, which we're very fortunate to have together in this exhibition. And yet, Velasco has often been looked at really in a Mexican context. Mexico had begun to exhibit at the World's Fairs from 1855. It was the first Latin American nation to do so, along with Peru. Velasco exhibits his works, at least one or two, depending on which one, or something like 60 in 1889, in Philadelphia, in Paris, in New Orleans, in Paris again in 1889, as he had in 1878, and then in Chicago in 1893. And in 1889, Velasco takes his first ever trip abroad. He goes to Paris as the head of the Fine Arts Committee for the Mexican delegation. And at this delegation, one of the roles of the people who worked on this exhibition, put it together, these Mexican bureaucrats, they worked for Porfirio Diaz, who at this point was the sort of de facto dictator of Mexico who ruled between the late 1870s and the beginning of the Mexican Revolution in 1910. And these Porfirian bureaucrats are often called científicos, so men of science. So there's sort of a technocratic approach to how they would like to show Mexico to potential foreign investors abroad. And the pavilion that they commission for Paris is this astounding work by Antonio Peñafiel. It has the look of an Aztec or Mexica temple with figures of Mexica gods adorning the facade, but it's entirely made of steel. So it's a great sort of example of the way that the modern and tradition could be brought together. And one of the goals of these Mexican sort of designers was making the Indian past, the indigenous past, an inherent component of Mexican identity. So it's a solution to this identitarian problem of being both Spanish and indigenous. How do you meld these together to create a kind of national image? And we've already seen something of that sort of thinking in the way that Velasco brings together different historical eras in his work. Velasco exhibited some 68 paintings at this exhibition. Very unfortunately, though, we've not been able to find any photograph of how they were displayed in the pavilion. You get a sense of what it looked like on the inside, one of the other sort of food displays on the right, but we don't know exactly how it was that Velasco exhibited his great paintings, which included quite a number that are actually in the exhibition upstairs. A French critic, Léon Cahoon, did see the pictures and comments on them. He says, Velasco knows how to make the trees and the mountains live and speak in his own country of Mexico. That is clear. I do not know what he would do in France. No one is a real writer except in his own language. And Velasco, who after the fact wrote a report on what he had seen at the exhibition in Paris, reveals himself to be something of an aesthetic conservative. He says in his report, quote, in spite of the great liberty for artists that prevails in France, there are a number among them who maintain good principles and do not let art just rush in. Today's situation would be very appropriate for despairing, for arriving at a complete Baroquism, at the most untasteful extravaganza, if not for a certain number of maestros with great talent who sustain high art. So you get the sense that Velasco would have not necessarily found much interest in paintings by the Impressionists, even though very few would have been exhibited at anything like a major exhibition. At this point, the Impressionists are not considered very important as yet. But you get a sense that Velasco was really drawn to sort of a traditional academic formation. And we see him here in this somewhat grainy photograph, unmoved really by much of what he saw. There are only a couple of images of him here. They include his passport, as also his exhibitor's card. So you get a sense of him. By this age, by about the age of 50, he's a sort of a beard down to here, which we'll come back to in just a moment. So there's also in the pavilion history paintings that represent the nation in a much more sort of didactic way. But landscape, by this point in the history of art, was really the way in which nations expressed something about themselves in the later 19th century. This painting was commissioned and purchased by the state for exhibitions abroad, and it shows a number of Tlaxcalan chiefs discussing how to divide up their territory before the arrival of Cortés. This picture by Velasco was also displayed in Paris in 1889, along with his great views of the Valley of Mexico. It's one of his other great large-size pictures. And in this, I think it's much clearer than in his landscape views of the Valley of Mexico, how progress, productivity, and industry enter into his understanding of Mexico in the 1870s and 80s. This is the bridge along the train route that goes between the east coast, the city of Veracruz, to the center of the peninsula, to Mexico City. You can also see in the left-hand foreground these extraordinarily scrupulous botanical illustrations, including of a mafafa plant. And we have a preparatory sketch for a picture much like this upstairs in the exhibition. Of course, what it calls to mind here in our own collection is Rain, Steam, and Speed, Turner's picture of the late 1840s. And this work, I think in a very similar way, gets at exactly that kind of interest among artists in representing the new and how it was that industrialization was beginning to change in very, very obvious ways, and more subtle ones, their interaction with the environment. And this is especially interesting, even though the great train picture by Velasco was painted at a different time. Velasco did, in fact, we know this now, visit London. So he came probably to the National Gallery in early December 1889. During his time at the Exposition in Paris, he was in Europe for about 8 months, most of that time in Paris. He makes a number of small trips, one to Italy, and his son is with him the whole time, and we have the letters that the son wrote back to his mother. And they complain of the usual things: my dad's not buying me any clothes, he's not giving me money for books, I can never hang out with my friends, all of these things. But the thing that's very useful for us as art historians, rather than just as parents, is that Velasco, it seems, according to his son, spent a lot of time in museums in Italy in particular. And he writes to his mother, and this is how we can assume that he came to the National Gallery, even if he was here for a very short time. He writes to his mother saying, all we do is go to museums every day. It is the most boring thing, I can't handle it. So we can imagine that poor Francisco Velasco, he would have suffered the same in this very building. Velasco then travels again abroad, his only other time abroad, in 1893 to Chicago, where he's the head of the Fine Arts delegation. So even though Velasco himself only goes abroad twice, he has many more international connections than we might assume. And many of them are channeled, it seems, through the person here on the screen, a Czech pharmacist, František Kaska. Kaska comes to Mexico with Maximilian in the 1860s. He seems to serve the Austrian Archduke there, and then after the execution of Maximilian, Kaska lives on in Mexico for the rest of his life, seemingly establishing quite a successful pharmaceutical business. He's also associated there with many other Europeans who have businesses in Mexico City. He's interesting for us because he comes to be one of Velasco's most important collectors. There are 8 paintings that he owns by Velasco at his death, and Velasco indeed was often used, or his paintings were used, as diplomatic gifts by the Mexican government and others who wished to curry favor. One painting was given to Ulysses S. Grant, the American president and general, and 2 were given to the previous Pope Leo XIII. One a view of the Cathedral of Oaxaca, and another a view of the Valley of Mexico, a reduced scale version. So there are all these connections that Kaska allows us to notice. And you'll have seen, if you've already been to the exhibition, that it's quite odd to have Mexican paintings in Prague. But that is why these works are still held in the National Museum of the Czech Republic. Because in 1907, at Kaska's death, he leaves his entire estate, which includes all kinds of art objects and things related to Maximilian, to the institution that becomes the National Museum of the Czech Republic. And then they arrive there in 1907, are cataloged as Mexican landscape, and then go unnoticed until 1970, when Pavel Stepanek, this art historian, working mostly on Spanish language topics in the Czech Republic, brings them to notice. And since then, they've been included in a number of exhibitions. So Kaska, with these ties between the Austro-Hungarian Empire and Mexico, also serves as sort of an unofficial emissary between Europe and Mexico, and also between Velasco and collectors abroad. This brings us to another key site in the history of 19th century Mexico, Querétaro. And of course, this is the place at which Maximilian, after ruling with more or less success for several years, opposed by the conservatives, supported by the conservatives and opposed by the liberals, eventually is captured by the forces of Benito Juárez. He retreats to Querétaro, this town, city, a bit north of Mexico City, to make a last stand, but eventually has to surrender. Benito Juárez, despite the approaches of several emissaries from other countries, European powers, decided that the Austrian Archduke must be executed, as an example. And so Maximilian is then put to death on the 19th of June, 1867, on the Cerro de las Campanas, the Hill of the Bells, just outside Querétaro. And he's put to death along with Miguel Miramón and Tomás Mejía, his 2 generals. Manet, one of the great French artists of the mid-19th century, takes a great sort of interest in this event. and he begins to paint several versions of it, turning this moment in contemporary news into a history painting, a grand scale work that is supposed to tell us something about human action. And this picture in the National Gallery's collection is the second version that he makes. It's not the final one. The final one is in the Kunsthalle in Mannheim. But the way that he puts them all together and begins to rethink, based on press reports, what it is that happened is interesting, especially for the way that it ties him in a peculiar way to Velasco. This execution, of course, means the end of official contacts between Austria-Hungary and Mexico. But those contacts are renewed quite a number of years later, and seemingly with the assistance of Francesc Casca. So this is, as you can see in the top right corner, Querétaro in April 1910. And what we have on the right here are a number of princes from the Heavenhuller family who are coming to Querétaro as representatives of the Austro-Hungarian government to inaugurate a chapel dedicated to Maximilian on the place of his execution, the Cerro de las Campanas. And the project, it seems, was initiated, at least in part, by Casca. And Casca, he's sitting here on the lower left, and in the middle is our painter, Velasco. He's there himself. And at a dinner that he hosts at his house for these representatives of the Austro-Hungarian government, he gives them a picture. He gives them a view of the Hill of the Bells with the newly inaugurated chapel on it. This is exactly the same location that Manet had been attempting to paint in the late 1860s, and Velasco returns to it in a very similar circumstance, thinking about these relations between Mexico and Europe. This is the second version of the work. The prime version was given to the Heavenhuller family, and despite our best searching, seems to have been lost at some point during the 20th century. This view shows the city from the west with the chapel in the foreground. And based on this, not long later, Velasco is awarded the Order of Franz Josef, the emperor, who is Maximilian's older brother. So there is this close relationship that we might not have thought of otherwise. And Velasco was very keen to be photographed with his Order of the Legion of Honor from his exhibition in France in 1889, along with his Order of Franz Josef. In 1901, shortly after this visit, Velasco suffers an accident in a train, and his mobility is much reduced over the last decade of his life. And he begins, in this period, to make a lot of works that are quite a bit smaller in tone, a bit brighter in their palette, and also return to things that he's painted in the past. And this is quite an affecting picture. It's a view of his hometown, of Temascalcingo, which he's painted previously in 1878, but he returns again to paint it in 1909. And here, just at the bottom, he says, "Nació el autor en este pueblo." The author, the painter, was born in this town. So it's a nice way, I think, in this last decade of his life that, in a reduced way, he returns to themes that have really given him something to think about. He has quite a loose touch in these later works, which are often painted on postcards, so very, very tiny indeed. And in these works, he takes up some of his typical topics, the views across the Valley of Mexico, the lakes of the Valley of Mexico, and you'll notice up here, still the evocation of Mexico. And that's, of course, the embossed seal that went on a postcard with the eagle and the nopal. But his last great work is one that, again, shrewdly links together history, science, astronomy, to narrate a moment in Mexican history. This work is painted in 1910, but it depicts the Great Comet of 1882, which appears in the skies over Mexico in late September and early October 1882. Velasco, in a little inscription at the very bottom, which you can't make out in the image, says that this was tomado del natural, so taken from life. So from notes that he seems to have made, little sketches during 1882. He then returns, it seems, later in life to paint this work, this great comet. And of course, there's a long tradition of representing comets as harbingers of change or moments of great tumultuous opportunity in Mexican history, but elsewhere. And it's interesting because in 1910, Halley's Comet reappears over Mexico, as it was forecast to have done. But a French scientist had predicted that the reappearance of Halley's Comet would be after that, there would be a deadly gas that would come out of the tail of the comet that would especially affect Latin America. And so people were very, very concerned by that possibility, and that it would diffuse sort of the air with cyanogen. Of course, this came not to be true. But it's interesting that Velasco, who has, for most of his career, kept quite removed from political sort of comment, as far as we can tell from what has come down to us, that he paints this in 1910, because 1910, of course, is the beginning of the Mexican Revolution. It's the end of the reign of Porfirio Diaz and the beginning of a decade of civil war. And comments, of course, are important, and especially in the visual culture of Mexico, they can be traced back to an image like this in the Duran Codex. Montezuma, standing on the roof of his palace in Tenochtitlan in 1519, was said to have seen a comet 2 years before the arrival of Hernán Cortés. And it wasn't known at the time if this was an ill or good augury. And I think Velasco is clearly trying to participate in exactly that kind of thinking about history. It's unclear what will happen, but this is a moment that must be marked and remembered. The very last work that he makes, according to the great scholar of Velasco and his great-granddaughter, María Elena Altamirano Pioy, is this work. According to her, he's painting this on the very day of his death. He begins, as he always did, with the sky and works down and leaves the bottom empty. And the bottom is empty, according to María Elena, who contributed to the catalog, because it was the work of the afternoon to complete the bottom, and he died before he could. And so Velasco, really throughout his career, is someone who returns again and again to these similar kinds of motifs of, sort of clouds scudding over the Valley of Mexico, and in this last work, returns again to some of those great subjects. He is an iconic figure in Mexican painting, even though he left really no notable followers. One person that studied with him during his teenage years was Diego Rivera, and Rivera really revered and admired Velasco. In the landscape background of this work, Zapatista landscape, you can see just how it is that the great mountains of the Valley of Mexico in the background feature, even in a work as abstracted as this one. And in the catalog, in Dexter's essay, there's a wonderful illustration of a Diego Rivera work painted when he's in his early 20s, which is really just sort of a version of a Velasco painting. So he's very affected by his teacher. And in the 1940s, when Velasco, who had been out of favor for some time since his death in 1912, returns to interest, there's a number of conferences held, and Rivera says about his teacher that, quote, Velasco's artwork is greater than a mural painting and a pyramid. It is a poem of color with mountains as its stanzas. So I hope seeing Velasco's work here in the National Gallery will open up these new vistas and new thinking about how landscape painting in Mexico might offer another way of understanding the interconnections of the global 19th century, and indeed the connections of the paintings in our own collection to the world beyond. Thank you.